I talked to 1,000 trapped investment real estate owners. This is what I learned on this episode of the 1031 Show. I'm Alex Stavorowski. We help people that have used real estate to win their financial freedom, but are now trapped playing the game and have no idea how to get back to living their dream life. These are some of the most common recurring feelings that I get from real estate investors and the thought process that we walk our clients through in effort to help solve them. And at the end of this episode, I want you to feel empowered to take action, to strive towards your dream life in 2025, to have your real estate investments working for you, not you working for them. One of the most common feelings that I get from real estate investors that I talk with that have owned real estate for a long time is my real estate is holding me hostage. I spoke with a couple that owns 4 properties currently, and this has been a goal for them for their entire life, is to have these properties to achieve financial and lifestyle freedom. But while the properties themselves were doing well and good cash flow, good tenants, they liked the people that they would work with, over time, the neighborhoods had changed, the demands on the properties had increased, the properties themselves had gotten older, and this was leading to more and more time and energy needing to be spent on the properties. So they were benefiting the couple, but at the end of the day, the time and energy that was being spent was starting to draw back on the lifestyle that they had. And I looked at him and asked, how often do you think about this, and how long has this been going on? He said it had been the better part of 5 years that this lifestyle change had been noticed by them, but he'd been doing this for over 30. He didn't know what else to do. And the problem with that is there wasn't an out for him. He didn't feel like there was something else he could do without sacrificing all of the good things that the properties were providing to them. And that led to that feeling of, I'm a hostage because I'm stuck in this one position. I don't have anything else that I can do, and I'm going to just have to keep doing this even though the problems are likely going to keep getting worse. So when we were talking, I asked him, have you ever heard of Stockholm Syndrome? This psychological feeling where somebody feels indebted almost to their captors and they have some sort of connection to them. That was basically what he was describing. So I asked him why he'd been dealing with these problems, and the basic answer was, well, the benefits they bring in are too good to lose. We need the income that these properties are providing each month. We need to be able to have them for long-term legacy goals, the things we want to pass on to our kids, all of these different good things, the reasons they'd gotten into real estate in the first place. But now we're being outweighed by these problems. When I looked at his wife to see how she was feeling about it, she said, we don't feel like we're in control. And they shared with me that the properties themselves had already caused them one health scare with a fall off a ladder a few years previously, but he was the main one responsible for fixing up the properties. And I said, well, here's the thing. There are different changes you can make, but at the end of the day, this needs to be geared towards an end goal. Because you started out with that goal in mind, but because of these different golden handcuffs that were coming in to keep them in place, he didn't feel like there were any changes they could make. And that was the problem. So how do we approach solutions? Well, for them, it was having a somewhat brutally honest conversation about what do we actually want to do here. At the end of their lives, do they want their tombstones to read that, well, we had 4 properties that we managed our entire lives? Or was that more just something that had been built around their egos of owning these properties specifically and doing a really good job at them? But taking that mindset shift from I'm a hostage to I own these properties, I get to decide what happens with them, is an ongoing process, but one that you need to have a real conversation to start. For this couple, having lived month to month on the income that they were pulling off of these properties, they didn't feel like they had time to ask, what can we really do, or what are we trying to do with this? It's more of what can we do, where the lifestyle that they wanted to live was being dictated by the properties, and that was a limiting factor. But you take a step back from that, you say, all things being equal, what would be the ideal situation? What is your purpose for these investments? And when it looks at a purpose for an investment, if it wasn't real estate, it wasn't a property that you owned and looked at, then we'd ask questions like, what does retirement look like for you? What do you need to do to prioritize your health and make sure that the longevity that you're after is at the top of the list? And just because real estate is its own entity doesn't mean that it has to be treated any differently, or that we approach it with our clients any differently to look at the purpose for that investment. Because once that's defined, then we can start on the planning. Then the planning comes into play to say, how do those steps factor out into a longer term strategy that maybe we need to unwind some of these things that have gotten so complex over the years. And our approach of purpose planning portfolio layered really well over this conversation, because for them, taking that step back to realize the purpose that they had in mind for their next 2 to 3, 4 decades of life was more about their health, their lifestyle, living and spending time with family, but being present when they were doing it and not having this nagging issue in the back of their heads of these properties are getting older and we have tenants to deal with, and what if that income doesn't come in or somebody stops paying rent? Those were such distractions for them that they could hardly focus on what the next year looked like, much less the next 10. So the purpose initially was health, family, and lifestyle. So when we look at a planning aspect of achieving that purpose, first we have to look at the individual properties and do a more strategic real estate analysis and help walk through what are these properties doing well, what are they doing poorly, and how do we need to make changes so that you can improve a situation before the wheels fall off. And the importance of putting a plan together to figure out what are these properties doing well and what could they be doing better allows us to take a step further towards a portfolio level of solutions and figuring out what are the actionable options for something else that could still provide the benefits needed, the income and the opportunity for this money to keep growing for their legacy and their kids, but also how can they shift the focus of their life away from maintaining these investments to having the investments work to support their goals of spending time with family and having a healthier lifestyle in general. And ultimately, it's up to them as to whether or not they want to do something, but putting that plan in place allows them to figure out what are the changes and the consequences of making changes, as much as it is what are the consequences of doing nothing. If they don't make any changes and continue with this for another 5 or 10 years, what happens, and will this problem just keep getting worse? So at the start of the conversation, their feeling of being held hostage by their properties, the framework of purpose planning portfolio needed to be followed in that order to allow them to first see that they didn't have to be held hostage. These properties weren't the only things that could help them to achieve their dream life, and there were opportunities outside of what they were currently doing to make a difference and make a positive, impactful change to their lives going forward. And that's the reason behind that framework of purpose planning portfolio, is to figure out what do those solutions ultimately look like and how can we make an effort towards solving the problems that people have. Another incredibly common feeling that I get from a lot of people I talk with is my real estate is doing everything I think it should, but for some reason there's still something missing. In other words, I don't know what I don't know. I've done the same thing for a long time, and while I've been comfortable enough with what I've done to build it to a point where it seems to be sustainable and it seems to be providing the kind of life that I want, but there's still something missing. There still feels like there's a gap in this portfolio that I've built or the properties that I have, because I want to make some changes, but I don't have enough comfort to do that going forward. So they're comfortable enough that they don't have an overwhelming need to make any immediate changes, but uncomfortable enough to realize that, well, there's this video I saw about something else that I don't know about, so I want to learn more about it. And often in those conversations, my first question is why? To what end? What is the purpose of learning more information? And they haven't quite gotten that far a lot of times. And figuring out, well, what does the ultimate strategy or ultimate opportunity look like for you isn't something they've considered. I recently spoke with a woman that when I asked her why and to what end, she jumped straight into the hamster wheel of a thought process that I could tell had been going on for quite some time. Kind of went something like this. Well, I've got a property and I have a tenant in place, and the property's pretty old, so I need to start making some repairs, but I can't do these repairs until the tenant gets out, and then the tenant's out and I'm not making any money from the property, but I don't have enough cash flow from this property to be able to put the significant amount of money in to make the repairs without a tenant in place. So I have to get a new tenant in there, which is another year-long lease, and once that year-long lease is in place, I can't make those renovations except for some small changes, maybe some paint, maybe some carpet. But here's the thing, I need that tenant in place to be earning the income to support my lifestyle the way I live right now, and I can't really really sacrifice it without it. So once that tenant's in there for another year, the property's going to fall into worse shape, which means I need to spend more money to get it fixed up to a place where I could either re-rent it to somebody or get it sold, because ultimately I'd like to get it sold to do something else. But then a year after year after year go by and the property keeps falling into disrepair, so that when I do have to go to sell it and I finally rip the Band-Aid and let the tenant leave, try to put so much money into it that I then have to sell it for a way higher price than it's probably worth, and I just don't know what to do. And I can see how that's exhausting. So I then asked, well, let's say it all works out. Let's say you do get the property sold. Then what? Well, again, she was on a hamster wheel. There's no getting off that wheel. And there was no thought for what comes next. She hadn't even gotten that far in the thought process because she was so consistently stuck in the same pattern. And she went on, even if I were to sell, what then? I trade up for a bigger property with more problems, more spaces to fix, more things to go wrong, and maybe more tenants to deal with at one time. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have those problems anymore. And I feel like this property is doing well right now, but any year that goes by, I get more and more concerned about everything just completely falling apart. And then I've lost a lot of money and wasted a lot of time and sacrificed a lot of things that I could have been doing otherwise, because this one property has been draining so much of my resources, so much of my time, so much of my money. So I took a minute after she had explained this entire thought process, and I sat there and said, I think this must be pretty emotionally exhausting for you. She said, it is, but I don't know what else to do. So it's easier to go with what I know than to try to make some changes and reach out into the wide unknown, worrying about spending a lot of money in taxes or losing a lot of value or having to sacrifice her lifestyle because she doesn't know enough about the next step to figure out what to do. And that's often the case with these investment real estate owners, is that messing with the status quo is scarier and much more intimidating than doing the same thing over and over, because it's the devil they know. It's the thing that they can keep doing for a long time, and yes, they'll put some money in here, put some money in there, but these big problems, well, that's down the road, and I haven't had to deal with it yet, and I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. But not actually putting numbers and thought to what does that actually look like if $100,000 needs to go into a property because it's gotten to such a point that nobody wants to live there, so you can't rent it, you're not making any money, and if you were going to sell it, you'd sell it for pennies on the dollar because it's in such a state of disrepair. So walking through that thought process, walking through the next 5 years, say that happens 2 years in, what does it look like for you? To them, it's a question they don't want to answer, don't want to think about. And unfortunately, it's a conversation that needs to be had, because when we're working through the purpose planning portfolio framework of a conversation and around any investment, especially real estate, those are the hard questions that people need to realize, that there are changes that need to be made sooner rather than later, because you won't have as many options, if any, when the time comes. Finding a solution that will make an impactful difference to somebody, enough of a difference to overcome that fear of changing the status quo, obviously will vary from person to person, situation to situation, and even property to property. But it's an important piece to understand and really identify, because that's how you make changes. You have to figure out what is going to be a substantial enough change to motivate somebody to do something, and is it in their best interest? But for someone that comes to me with the idea of, I feel like my real estate's doing well, but something's missing, the common ground starting place is really knowing that there are other options out there beyond the same thing that they've been doing. Once someone has an idea that there are opportunities, and you've talked through what something else, something different might look like, and they can relax on the idea that they don't know anything else, so I can't make any changes, then it's when you take a step back, look at the bigger picture of, if you could make the change you want to see happen, what does that look like? What does this property actually need to be doing for you, that we help to identify that missing link? What is the gap in what they're feeling right now, and how do we address it? The purpose of their investment is the starting point for every strategy, every opportunity we look into. So again, when I come back to the question of to what end, what is driving you to look into other options, what sparked some interest in the idea that there could be something else out there for me than what I know right now, I have yet to talk with anyone that truly has it all figured out. They may feel like they have it all figured out, but at the end of the day, they're still on a phone call with a stranger to talk through alternatives to their current situation and what that might look like. So if that's where they're starting from, then for them, there is still a gap in what is going on in their life and what these properties are doing for them. So when I talk to somebody about the gap between where they are and where they want to be, the illustration I like to use is, imagine you're hiking in a mountain and you come up to a crevice, but the far side of that crevice is covered in mist and you can't really see where it is or where the road picks back up again. Could be a long step, could be a jump. You might have to even build a bridge to get from one side to the other. But if you don't know where that other side is and where it starts, where the road picks up, then you're never going to be able to confidently cross that gap. So you're always going to stay on the near side of it. And when we talk through this illustration, I say, so for you, what does that far side look like? Where do you pick up on the road to keep walking towards this dream life that you have in mind? And by this point, we've talked through what does their dream life look like, whether it is spending more time with their family, focusing on their health, focusing on other hobbies and goals that they've had for a long time, but have spent so much time pacing back and forth on this one side of the gap because they feel held back and they don't know how far it is to the other side. Then it's always going to be easier to do nothing and stay put. Depending on who I'm talking with, if you want to get things a little bit more dramatic, you tell them to imagine that there's some sort of avalanche coming down the hill above them. And you don't quite know how long it's going to take to get there, but it's only coming down on this one side of the path that you're on. So you do have to cross that gap to get to the other side to avoid the problems that are coming your way. But again, you don't quite know when or how bad it might be if that avalanche reaches you. So there isn't a huge motivation to get across the gap right away. But that's where the framework of purpose planning portfolio really takes hold, is knowing that if I can identify the far side of this gap, and then I can figure out on the planning level what it takes to get across the gap, then if that problem starts getting closer and closer and I realize that there's no way out, I have a plan in place to cross to the other side. Whether that was building a bridge, taking a leap, but it doesn't have to be something that's done still just jumping into open air, because you've identified the far end of where you're trying to go. So the purpose helps us to build out a plan to figure out what materials, what steps need to be taken to get from one side to the other. And the portfolio is really just the materials themselves. How are those being used to build together this plan and help someone achieve their purpose? But going with, I don't know what I don't know, is only going to get you so far, or it's only going to last so long. If some of these problems with a deteriorating asset like real estate are just a ticking time bomb, then figuring out what those next steps need to look like should happen sooner rather than later. The third recurring feeling that I talk to a lot of real estate owners about is their legacy. They want these properties to be passed on to their kids, to their grandkids, to their nephews, nieces, anybody else after they're gone. They got into these properties for a multi-generational wealth purpose, and they want to be able to pass that on in an efficient and positive way. The third recurring feeling that I get a lot from real estate owners is, I want to help my family. I want to help my legacy. I want to help my kids. Passing these properties on is a primary reason why I bought them in the first place, because I know this is going to be an asset I hold for my entire life. I don't want to sell. I don't want to pay taxes, and I want them to benefit from it as much as possible. Now, it does vary from person to person what this looks like as far as involving their family or passing properties on to their kids. For some people, it's something that will only happen after they're gone. They want these properties to just keep earning them money. They need this as retirement income, but it's an asset that they need to hold for their lifetime. And then once they're gone, their kids will inherit it. They get the step up in basis. They're able to sell these properties without the tax liability. And that's what sold them on buying into this type of investment in the first place, is I've got cash flow during my life and I have appreciating assets that ultimately will pass on in a legacy format and build a portfolio of assets for multi-generational wealth. On the other hand, I talk with a lot of people that are in real estate more actively during their lifetime, and they see this as an opportunity to help build something more active with their kids, something where maybe the kids are grown and out of the house and building careers of their own, but they want to get involved in real estate. So I'm going to buy this property going to have my kids come in and manage it and learn what that looks like. So ultimately, this is their property to inherit. They get to decide what to do with it, but they're not left to their own devices when figuring out, how do I deal with real estate? How do I manage a property? Or should I sell this and do something else? They have their own understanding of the investments, and that's how some people prefer to pass on their legacy, is making it more actively involved with that real estate investment during their lifetime with their kids. Now, even for people that I talk to that hate the properties they own, they say, why would I sell and pay the taxes and lose all that value when if I can just hold out, I can give these properties to my kids? And that's unfortunate to hear, because most of the time that's been the feeling for quite a while, is that these people don't know what else to do. They don't want the properties anymore, but the goals that they have in mind of passing on this asset with as much value as possible outweigh any of the negativity or any of the problems that they're dealing with in their current life. And the only outlet they see is selling and paying the taxes and basically having the net amount left over to give to their kids. That's where tax strategies like the 1031 exchange are very important in understanding that you can move from one property to a property of a different type for purposes of maintaining your lifestyle and owning that real estate throughout your lifetime, but still allowing that property to pass on without ever paying the taxes. So using the 1031 as a tax strategy in your lifetime, swapping that property one for another until those properties are inherited, is a huge benefit that a lot of people need to understand. I was talking with a guy on the East Coast just a couple days ago, and he was telling me that half of his portfolio of about 10 properties were too far away for him to want to keep dealing with. He was getting into his 70s and ready to be done with those. But the other half he had bought more strategically as his kids had gotten older and moved out and gotten families of their own, where they're in one place. He buys a property near them and is looking to help them build up a portfolio of assets where they're going to be managing the property, so he doesn't have to be on site to deal with that. But it is something where that investment is held specifically for a purpose, for his kids, for his legacy, but not something that he'll have to worry about dealing with on his own until he passes it on. The other 5 properties that were not being located near the kids were something he was trying to figure out what to do with, because he didn't want to pay the taxes. He'd owned these properties for quite a while, but the demand on his time and energy to go out and visit them, even if it was one call every couple of weeks, was starting to get too much for him to want to deal with. He wanted to spend much more of his time focused on the 5 properties around his kids and enjoying the time that he had to be present, but blending the goals of his lifestyle with his investments that he'd built up over time. So we talked through that a little bit more, and I asked him a couple questions about what does that look like, how involved do the kids want to be, some of the harder questions of, are you placing this responsibility onto them, or is it something that they are wanting to do? Do you think it's a good idea, or do they think it's a good idea? And unfortunately, it's not always something that people factor in, as they've used real estate in their own lifetime to benefit greatly for the cash flow and the appreciation of that value, but ultimately passing that on as a responsibility to their children is not something that's been discussed in depth. And it's not necessarily an investment-based discussion that we have at that point. It's more emotional and personal, but figuring out for them and having the conversations that they need to have with their family helps to define the purpose of that investment for the duration of their lifetime. So while he'd had properties for a long time in specific areas, was trying to get rid of some, trying to keep the others, we talked through piece by piece what that looked like, how to build out these different parts of his portfolio for the best, most efficient use. So the 1031 exchange, allowing him to sell these properties that he had been wanting to get rid of, didn't want the family to have to inherit, and buy into something that was going to be much more passive for his time. We talked through opportunities like the Delaware Statutory Trust, or DST, that allows him to have much more passive ownership of a property, but still maintain that tax-efficient benefit of the 1031 exchange to purchase into them. So taking half of a portfolio from more actively managed to a passive portfolio and an active portfolio that had a specific purpose. And that's the framework of purpose planning portfolio, and a good example of why it's so important to have that initial purpose truly identified, because it may be different depending on the properties or depending on the portfolio. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's not to say that the purpose for your entire portfolio needs to be congruent, because on one hand, you need passive investments that still allow for tax-efficient exchanges, but you don't want to spend all of your time and money on all of the properties at the same time. So when we talk about a legacy for your kids, your heirs, whoever it might be that inherits something after you're gone, you can't take it with you. So what is the most efficient way for that to be working during your lifetime and afterwards? And a lot of these feelings tie into each other pretty dynamically, where you have somebody that wants to pass the properties on, doesn't know what they don't know, and feels like they're a hostage. But ultimately, these warring feelings went out to the point of, I want to hold on for my kids. I want to hold on so that I don't lose 20 to 30% of this value to taxes. So they're going to just keep doing the same thing through the next decades of their life until those properties get passed on. And that's what we talk through in the planning portion of our conversation, is what are the different opportunities you have access to that allow you to achieve all of these purpose goals at the same time, but not have to deal with the negative consequences of owning an investment that is only drawing down on your lifestyle. So if you own investment real estate, start by asking yourself, what's the purpose? Why did I get into this? What am I doing with it right now? And where am I trying to have it take me going forward? For you, your spouse, your family, your heirs, your legacy, all of these people that are going to be impacted by the decisions you make today and going forward, what does that look like? What is the purpose for this investment? And I'll repeat it again because it's so important. You have to start with the purpose so that you are working with your investments, not for them. And if that's as far as you can get, trying to figure out what your purpose for an investment for your life might look like, then give us a call, because we talk through that very thing with people on a daily basis. What comes next? What comes after your purpose? And how can you strive towards achieving those goals? If that's you, click the link in the description below, schedule a call with us, and we can talk through those very things. And if you want more content and information on the things we discussed on today's episode, you know what to do. Thanks, and we'll talk to you next time on the 1031 Show.
Impact 1031 is a DBA of Ridgegate Financial, LLC. Not an offer to buy nor a solicitation to sell securities. All investing involves risk. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Speak to your finance and/or tax professional prior to investing. Securities offered through Emerson Equity, LLC. Member FINRA SIPC. Only available in states where Emerson Equity, LLC is registered. Emerson Equity, LLC is not affiliated with any other entities identified in this communication. Investment advisory services offered through AE Wealth Management. Emerson Equity, Ridgegate Financial, and AE Wealth Management are not affiliated entities.